Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The third law of sci-fi writer Arthur C. Clarke is one of many sci-fi tropes Warhammer 40k falls back on when it starts to discuss religion. The universe of 40k is full of metaphysical beings, otherworldly entities, and oppressive religions, but when you look into what they really are, it usually turns out that none of them are really gods after all. So, in the first of these warp-themed videos, I tried to give a decent description of how the warp in 40k actually functions. I mean, as far as we can tell. It's an important element of the 40k setting, and despite being a bit of a deus ex machina for the writers, it does follow some consistent rules. But one of the roles the warp plays in the setting of 40k is to allow this universe access to the classic fantasy themes of religion and gods. The powers of chaos, the Emperor, the Old Ones. 40k is full of metaphysical entities, unknowable godlike beings, and religions that follow them. Words like godlike and demigod are thrown around all the time, and Warhammer has a load of fun providing us with all the many ways in which they might not actually be what they seem. So one of the questions that comes up online quite a lot is, well, are they? Is Khorne or the Emperor or any of the rest of them actually a god? Whenever I raise this point in videos that 40k's gods might not actually be what they seem, I get certain sorts of comment. So it's clear that for some people there's no discussion to be had here. But I think the conversation about what the gods of Warhammer 40k really are is an interesting one. Partly because it involves looking at all of 40k's influences, but also because it really exposes the satire and black humour at the heart of the setting. So, how do we define a god in fiction? This question has been a staple of science fiction and fantasy settings for decades, handled in all sorts of different ways by all sorts of different writers in any setting that includes strange entities, all-powerful beings, or just wildly different tech levels. The characters, who are the focus of these stories, don't even have to be that advanced to make answering this question quite difficult. It's everywhere, from classic novels to about 1 million episodes of Star Trek. In, say, The Return of the Jedi, C3PO is worshipped as a god by the Ewoks. In the canon, this is because they have a prophecy about their god, the Golden One, returning to them, and they think C3PO is him for, obvious reasons. So, is C3PO a god? Most of us would say no, he's been mistaken for one. But what if we define a god as anything sufficiently powerful with supernatural abilities that you don't understand? And C3PO, well, he can certainly do a lot of things Ewoks would think are very powerful, or supernatural, his mate is a space wizard. Or we might define God as anything people believe to be one, and the Ewoks certainly believe him to be one. Both of those definitions are used in other sci-fi, including in Warhammer 40k, so is C3PO a god? Okay, if we were actually to do something as silly as trying to answer that question, there are a few ways we could approach it. The first is by comparing 40k's gods to what real-world religions think gods are. How do we define God in the real world? Much like my Is Warhammer art video, I don't think we're completely going to answer that question in a short video about toy soldiers, but the setting does give us a few starting points. Humans have invented thousands of religions, and they've invented even more gods, but the religions present in 40k are obviously influenced by the ones that the writers were most familiar with. The mythology of the Abrahamic religions, particularly Christianity, particularly medieval Catholic Christianity, and then the famous in the West classical ones you sort of learn about at school. Ancient Greek myths, to a certain extent ancient Egyptian ones or Norse beliefs, or particularly with the Eldar, some pre-Christian Celtic myths. That's most of the influences, so what do they have in common? All these belief systems are theists. They believe in a god or gods who specifically intervene in the universe. Often those are creator gods, that's another defining trait of theism, who created the world or the universe or just us. In Abrahamic religions, God created the earth in 7 days. Odin and his brothers created the earth from the corpse of Ymir. In the Greek mythos, Zeus and Poseidon and all the rest aren't creator gods, but they are related to them. They're the grandchildren of the primordials who sort of fulfill the same role. All of them are linked in some way to creation, and importantly predate mortals like us. They also tend to really care about how humans act, either as a sort of moral example or as harsh judges and arbiters of people who behave badly. And they're also often linked to an afterlife. They don't always have to have created it, but often they judge who gets to go to it. There, that's a pretty broad definition of a real-world god. Obviously, there are a million other religions that have made up different systems, but those religions aren't that evident in Warhammer. So we could ask, does anything in 40k do these things? And then use that as our criteria. Or, in an attempt to solve this, we could go the other way. We could ask if there's an in-world definition of a god that we should use instead of this. Is there some way in which the setting uses the word god that we should conform to? But honestly, I think all of this earnest questioning is kind of missing the point. There's no consistent redefining of the word God in 40k. There's no 40k specific way of using that word that works for everything in the setting. And despite that, often the factions in world genuinely believe their god does most or all of these things. This is still the criteria used by people in 40k. It's just that nothing in the universe, from the Chaos Powers to the Emperor of Mankind to the Catan, totally live up to it. And what 40k does again and again is show us an entity that some of the characters in world think is God, and then show us what it actually is, and then ask the more interesting question: does it matter? 40k has loads of fun with this because it's a magpie of a setting. Over the years, 40k has folded in loads of different sci-fi cliches, historical events, and even pseudo-scientific theories that explain away all of its gods. A lot of these are tropes, common ideas in fiction, and as is the nature of 40k, everything's just rolled in. The writers and designers picking and choosing stuff they like the sound of and then just making it part of the setting. So in this video, I'm going to go through all these themes and tropes that 40k uses to poke fun at its so-called gods, and then take a look at all the entities that claim that title and explain what they really are. Okay, there's loads of different ideas we could talk about, so for the purposes of this video, I've grouped them into 6 broad categories, which we can go through and then apply to all the different so-called gods. All the in-world belief systems of Warhammer conform to one or more of these ideas, so I've given them some memorable names. The first I'm going to call Sufficiently Advanced Technology. This is Clarke's third law from the start of the video. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke proposed 3 adages, originally in an essay entitled Hazards of Prophecy, The Failure of Imagination, in 1962, of which the third is the most widely cited. Clarke himself repeated it many times, and it wasn't a totally new thought. He draws on similar adages from earlier writers. Isaac Asimov, the author of the Foundation series, wrote that an uninformed public tends to confuse scholarship with magicians, which is a plot point in Foundation, and even Agatha Christie had similar thoughts in 1933. The supernatural is only the nature of which the laws are not yet understood. Which sounds like an in-world attempt to describe the warp, to be honest. What did Agatha Christie know? And there are more, but of all of them, Clarke's third law is probably the most common example, and it's inspired a number of variations. one of which, by the science writer Michael Shermer, known as Shermer's Last Law, is a bit more relevant to this video. Any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. The sci-fi trope here is of an advanced species with advanced technology being seen either as magicians or as gods by a less advanced society. It's seen in all sorts of sci-fi universes, including ones we've mentioned here before, and in 40k it's endemic, not only in the fact that the warp itself is often shown as a science people don't understand, with psychers mislabeled as witches and wizards, but also by actual advanced species being worshipped as a god all over the setting. Which leads us into the next trope here, ancient aliens. Ancient aliens, or ancient astronauts, is a real-world series of, let's call them theories for now, that hold that many of the technological and archaeological wonders of the ancient world are in fact evidence of an ancient extraterrestrial species visiting Earth. The pyramids of Egypt or of Mesoamerica, certain inscriptions on ancient tablets, the Moai of Easter Island, the Nazca lines in Peru are all evidence of an ancient mother culture who came from space to teach humanity. The idea was originally popularized in science fiction in the earlier 20th century, before it started to be promoted in earnest in around the 1950s through to the 1980s, the most famous book probably being Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. In fact, there are even real-world religions based on this sort of thing. That's kind of what Scientology is. And it continues to pop up here and there in popular culture. There was even a terrible Netflix series pretty recently claiming similar things. It's important to say that all these theories are widely considered to be unscientific. They're at best pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeological, with no credible claim as a real theory, and many people have pointed out that they are in part rooted in a sort of colonial European exceptionalism. Oh yeah, the pyramids of Egypt must have been built by aliens, because there's no way the primitive people in that part of the world would have been capable of it, etc, etc. It is not a serious real-world field of study, but it's still quite a popular idea in sci-fi, from, again, about 1 million episodes of Star Trek, that's basically what the Prime Directive is meant to warn against, to the most obvious example, Stargate. And it pops up in the Warhammer universe in a few different ways, both in 40k and in Warhammer Fantasy, where it's usually meant to be interpreted as a bit of a joke. Related to both these ideas is the idea of cargo cults. Cargo cults are a real-world phenomenon, though study of them has also been a bit dodgy over the years. During the Second World War, various indigenous communities in often the South Pacific were suddenly confronted with major world powers using their islands as bases of operations, building landing strips, stationing planes and soldiers, bringing in new technologies, new foodstuffs, and often trading with the locals, and then, just as suddenly, leaving. And this gave rise to a strange phenomenon where rituals would develop on the islands with the aim of attracting back the food and the planes. Sometimes these would take the form of acting out remembered military exercises, or building planes in effigy, or of worshipping religious figures that were based on the soldiers stationed there. Sometimes this was encouraged by local leaders who wanted a way to bring prosperity back. Studies of these cults started in the mid-40s, and as you might expect, can have a tendency to be quite dismissive and racist. People have pointed out that cargo cult is a massive oversimplification of what actually happened, and though many of these died out over time, some of them still exist today. In this video, I'm going to use this to describe any situation in which a population witness something they don't understand and then develop religious or magical beliefs or rituals based on trying to make it happen again, or maybe to keep it happening. As you can imagine, there's a fair amount of crossover in these first three, though they are technically all different things. The next one, though, is a little more cynical: the deliberate invention and dissemination of religions as a tool of social control. I'm naming this one the Lisan al-Gaib after its most famous sci-fi example, Dune. Obviously, the promotion of certain religions or certain aspects of religions as a way of controlling society or propping up powerful people is something incredibly common in the real world. It should not be necessary for me to list here the times religion has been used as an excuse for war, or a way of othering certain populations, or manipulated to allow rulers free rein in how they rule. It's arguable that that is the point of organized religion, but depiction of this in sci-fi and fantasy can can go way further. In Dune, the Bene Gesserit use methods like these in massive schemes lasting millennia. In the book, the religion of the Fremen of Arrakis has been deliberately engineered over time, so they have faith in the appearance of a prophet, the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the other world, with the intent that the Bene Gesserit themselves will then be able to choose who that will be, and whoever that is will have a loyal army ready to support them. We see similar things in Warhammer. Religious control is used by a number of factions in the mundane real-world way, in similar ways to the Bene Gesserit of Dune, and also through weird biological and psychic control. Up next, we start to get a bit closer to the weird stuff with eldritch horrors. One of the bigger influences on Warhammer 40k, and like fantasy and horror in general, is H.P. Lovecraft, whose Cthulhu mythos is based around the mind-bending existence of beings so absurdly powerful and otherworldly that even witnessing a fraction of them would break your mind. In the world of Cthulhu, which includes the original stories and then a load more written by authors after Lovecraft's death, these beings are called Great Old Ones. Powerful, terrifying things that exist within and outside of the dimensions our brain can cope with, making them essentially unknowable, and people in the world, if they find out about them, have a tendency to worship them as gods. The question of whether they actually are gods, or which ones count as gods, is a question in the Cthulhu mythos too, but it's not directly addressed that often. The original stories, at least, are very ground level, dealing with normal people who accidentally find out about a cult. Obviously, this is a massive influence on 40k. I'm using it here to describe any super powerful cosmic entity that's depicted as existing anyway, but then people build a religion around. All of these first 5 tropes are similar in that they deal with real-world things that do exist, but are then misunderstood by their followers who mistakenly worship them as gods. The last one is a little bit different. I'm calling this the power of belief. One of the most common ways in which fantasy and sci-fi writers include stories about gods in their universes is by creating a new definition of that word and a mechanical pseudoscientific system for how they are created. This is less common in early fantasy. The Lord of the Rings, for example, has a pantheon of gods that would be very recognizable to anyone studying real-world religions. There's a supreme being called Eru Iluvatar, who thought the world into existence and also created lesser godlike beings, the Valar and the Maiar, and all those beings created the mortal species of Middle-earth. But as sci-fi and fantasy moved forwards, more countercultural, scientific, or just atheist authors moved away from this idea that their worlds just, have gods, and towards the idea that gods are created by some in-world process. Often the idea here is that people create gods out of some sort of in-world belief energy, and also as an analogy to, humans making up gods in real life. The obvious examples of this, for me, are the works of Terry Pratchett and, to a lesser extent, Neil Gaiman, both of whom are pretty contemporaneous with the start of Warhammer 40k. In Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, belief is a fundamental force in the universe. The Discworld runs on the theory of narrative causality, which suggests that things happen in certain ways because everyone knows that's how they should happen, which is conveniently why everything tends to wrap up into a neat story. An ancillary to this is that on the disc, if enough people believe in something, some sort of anthropomorphic representation of it will pop into existence. This is played with loads in that series. Death, a being who exists because everyone believes that someone comes for you when you die, is a main character of multiple books. Hogfather concerns a plot to try and kill the disc's equivalent of Santa, and then the fallout when all that spare belief energy is sloshing around. And gods are manifestations of that same system. Belief sloshes around in the firmament like lumps of clay spiraling into a potter's wheel. That's how gods get created, for example. They clearly must be created by their own believers, because a brief resume of the lives of most gods suggests that their origins certainly couldn't be divine. They tend to do exactly the things people would do if only they could, especially when it comes to nymphs, golden showers, and the smiting of your enemies. Enough people believing a god exists means that it does, and the more people who believe, the more powerful the god is. In false gods, one of the main characters is an all-powerful deity of a monotheistic culture who is trapped in the body of a tortoise because he's run out of belief. While everyone follows the state religion, no one actually truly believes anymore. We see a similar thing in Neil Gaiman's book American Gods, where the power of gods is also directly tied to how many people truly believe in them, and where the main characters are locked in a conflict with new gods, personifications of the things people actually do believe in, like media or technology. Universes that use the power of belief get to tell stories about gods and religions by redefining what the word God means. The Discworld, or American Gods' definition of the word God, is not the same as the one used by any real-world religion. Most Christians do not believe their God exists because of belief energy created by humans. There are some New Age religions that believe similar things about magic and willpower, and it's certainly a good metaphorical description atheists might ascribe to, that gods are created by people, but these are both cases of having gods by changing what that word means. The power of belief is used here as a shorthand not only for the specific mechanism, that there's a sort of belief energy that creates gods, but also for any similar mechanism. The author has invented a system in world that justifies the existence of entities so that they can have gods. So there, 6 ways in which Warhammer uses real-world ideas and sci-fi tropes to puncture the idea of real, actual gods existing in its universe. Everything described as a god in Warhammer tends to actually, upon closer inspection, fall into one or more of these categories. So, what do the different factions in the Warhammer universe actually believe in? And how aware are they of its true nature? Depending on the faction, the gods of Warhammer might have devout followers who are totally fooled, completely devoted to their religion and unaware of the truth, or they might have followers who understand these beings more as mythological characters, or who are well aware that the things they call gods are just aliens. When you think of Necron gods, people tend to picture the Catan, but that's not really true. The Catan are described as the first form of life to emerge in our material world. When the universe was born, intelligent, non-corporeal creatures arose formed of shifting energy, feeding on the energies of stars, they're often called star vampires, and ignoring all the boring matter. When the ancient Necrontyr discovered the existence of these beings, they formed for them living metal bodies in the shape of their ancient dead gods. The Necrontyr had a religion already that worshipped their sun as a sort of god of death. The word Catan means star god, but of course that's a translation. It's questionable if the ancient Necrontyr actually worshipped the Catan as gods, or knew all along exactly what they were. The Catan are certainly extremely powerful, with powers far in advance of most regular species. They're often described as god-like, but so is everything, but their powers do seem to be based on actual science. They were able to teach the Necrons about biotransference, for example, and it's implied that a lot of the reality-bending tech the Necrons employ comes from their understanding of the Catan. The Catan, in our little list, are sufficiently advanced technology mixed with ancient aliens, but also with a massive dose of unknowable eldritch horror. Their names in particular are very Lovecraftian. And the Necrons are a great example of that Arthur C. Clarke quote. They literally have technology so advanced it looks like magic. And in another little poke at this sort of folk belief, there's at least one story of a human planet being rescued by a Necron, and over time that belief changing to the idea that they were just saved by silver space marines. If we're talking about the Catan, then the obvious next ones up are the Old Ones. Now, they're even more explicitly described as a race of physical beings who, after long study and advancement, understood the universe, particularly the warp, so incredibly well that they developed abilities that were, yet again, godlike. They could forge stars, control the warp, build vast dimensional systems like the Webway, and genetically engineer new species like the Eldar, the Orcs, and the Jakero. There is some evidence that both the Eldar and the Orcs worship badly remembered elements of them as if they were gods, but in reality, they're pretty consistently depicted as a real-world advanced species, a mix of sufficiently advanced technology and ancient aliens. In fact, in Warhammer Fantasy, where the Old Ones and their servants servants, the Slan, also exist, their stronghold is in the old world equivalent of Central and South America, which is where a huge amount of ancient alien theory draws its inspiration. The fact that the magic space frogs descended to that part of the world and inspired the building of pyramids in Warhammer is a direct reference to ancient alien theory and a bit of a joke at its expense. Okay, let's switch to the ones that are a bit more technological. The Leagues of Votan are quite a simple one. They have a belief system built around the worship of Votan, essentially giant artificial intelligences that they mostly, but not completely, still know how to use. Since the Votan literally create new kin from modified templates supplied by the very first colonists, they're known as ancestor cores, and the kin's religion is depicted as a form of ancestor veneration, which is slightly different to a theist religion. Incidentally, that's also how a lot of Space Marine belief systems work. They venerate the memory of their ancestors rather than worshipping some entity as a god. Anyway, the Votan are more aware than most of the tangible nature of the things they revere, but the themes used here are a mix of sufficiently advanced technology and a bit of cargo cults. But the real masters of both of those in 40k are of course the Adeptus Mechanicus. The cult Mechanicus is a religion that venerates something they call the machine god, a tripartite deity consisting of the machine god itself, a being that embodies all knowledge and whose divine instruments are humanity, the Omnissiah, the earthly avatar of the machine god, commonly thought to be the Emperor, and the motive force, the sort of concept of energy, frequently electrical energy. The Mechanicus believe that all knowledge is sacred, the quest for knowledge is a holy journey, that machines are such a perfect blend of form and function that they could only be divine, and that machines have spirits that must be entreated for them to work. In universe, this system evolved for two big reasons. First, the Mechanicus have custody of ancient advanced technology they don't really understand how to use, which has led to the belief that machines just doing their job, maybe a bit unreliably, must have spirits that you need to placate to get them to do it correctly. This is actually played for laughs a lot in 40k, and it's a mix of the cargo cult and the idea of sufficiently advanced technology again. Actually, the Mechanicum owes a lot to Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where for a time human knowledge is deliberately turned into a religion to better protect it through the ages. The Mechanicus tick even more boxes than that though. Their beliefs are encouraged by the fact that underneath Mars is a shard of a Catan, and the slow, soft influence of that being has pushed the beliefs of the Martians towards the idea of some machine god that sleeps beneath the surface of the planet. So there's a little bit of eldritch horror there too, but also this being was put there deliberately by the Emperor in order to create this belief system that he thought might be useful in the future. So that's our very first tick for the Lisan al-Gaib. Let's run with that. The gene stealer cults are, let's not forget, cults. As they spread their genes across the population, they create this psychic beacon which alerts Tyranid hive fleets to their presence, and then as the Tyranid hive fleet gets closer, the gene stealer cults are inspired to rise up in revolution. To the cultists, they see the Tyranids as angels, harbingers of the divine judgment that's coming any day now. Essentially, this is the rapture. But that is of course false. This whole system is an elaborate evolutionary adaptation designed to destabilize worlds so that the Tyranids can conquer them easily. It may not be planned on paper like many of the others, but it's definitely an engineered religion, another sort of Lisan al-Gaib. After this, we get into the realm of all the different sorts of warp entity. The various sorts of warp gods that species worship all tend to sit on the line between eldritch horror and the power of belief. As I mentioned in the last video, there definitely are intelligent things that live, in a sense, in the warp and that affect the real world, but they're usually also unknowable beings that mortals can never truly understand. So their theming is often eldritch horror, but the mechanics behind them are usually the power of belief. The Warhammer world actually has two variants on that theme. You've got psychic energy, which is what the warp is formed of. It exists in a state of chaos and can either naturally or artificially be formed into intelligent entities. It's not actually belief, it's emotional energy generated from strong emotions, but in the Warhammer world does the same thing. And then you've you've got strong willpower or faith, which is like a superpower you get from self-belief. Strong-minded individuals can marshal their little personal spark of warp energy as a defense against the warp. It's a bit muddy if that sort of belief actually makes gods, but the point still stands. Both of these are mechanical systems invented for the world of Warhammer so we can have things that do the job of gods. Mork and Gork, the gods of the orcs, are quite simple. The orc gods are formed from all the psychic energy created by orcs in the world, and in the warp, all that psychic energy gloops together, eventually forming into two vague warp entities. Gork, who is brutal but also cunning, and Mork, who is cunning but also brutal. These are probably the simplest of all the warp entities, the power of belief and a little bit of eldritch horror. That also counts for Tau-Var. That's a warp entity of the greater good created by the human members of the Tau Empire. Actual Tau don't really have enough warp presence to create anything. Again, it's a warp entity, a protector spirit created from belief or fear. Just like the orc gods, it's the power of belief and maybe a little bit more eldritch horror. Okay, the Eldar gods are an interesting spin on that. The Eldar gods are presented like a mythological pantheon, a group of gods dedicated to various realms of experience, and the Eldar have tales about their exploits in much the same way as we have tales about the Greek gods. But there are a few options for what they really are. One option is that the Eldar gods are actually the Old Ones. It's how they remember and perceive them, and we've already gone over that. But the other option is that the Eldar gods are deliberate constructions. The Eldar were created originally to fight in the Old Ones' war in heaven, and the Eldar are very psychic. It's noted that the Eldar created warp entities to fight on their behalf, and that maybe over time, once the war was over and the Old Ones gone, the Eldar forgot what they were and they became mythologized as gods, the few remaining ones still able to actually do stuff in the warp if the Eldar did the correct rituals. So again, this is the power of belief mixed with eldritch horrors, but it's also framed a little bit like forgotten science. There's a bit of sufficiently advanced technology in there too. And that's a similar blend to the Emperor. The Emperor is a warp entity who used to be a person. After taking on a ton of warp power before the Great Crusade, and then again at the end of the Heresy, and then being strapped into a massive psychic amplifier for 10,000 years, the Emperor in 40k is a sort of fractured warp being under considerable strain, attempting to keep himself together and psychically help out humanity where he can, but also mistakenly worshipped by humanity as their god. So like all the other ones here, we have a little bit of eldritch horror and a ton of the power of belief, but this is also folded in with a load of sufficiently advanced technology. The overall theme of the Emperor is that he was one of the few people who understood how the warp worked, almost as a science, and that ancient humans from the Dark Age of technology understood that too, and that the Golden Throne was just a device built to amplify that power. And this is something he spent an awful lot of energy trying to get everyone else to accept, but because no one understands that anymore, the people of 40k see a warp entity attempting to help them out and perceive it as God doing miracles. In terms of his role within the setting, he's almost Clarke's third law in action. Right, the ones we've probably all been waiting for then are the Chaos Gods, the ones that are most commonly referred to as gods. Let's start out by saying that these are definitely themed as eldritch horrors. They're mind-bending entities from beyond reality, and witnessing them involves being driven to the edge of sanity. There's a lot of Lovecraft in here. They're also the most obvious form of the power of belief. The Chaos Gods, in fact chaos as a whole, is literally made from the psychic energy of real space species, which is portrayed as just a natural mechanic in the setting. No creator made it that way. But one of the things that really confuses the issue with Chaos is that they're also a bit of a lisan al-gaib. The Chaos Gods are the only ones of these warp entities that actively encourage the idea that they definitely are gods and you should definitely worship them, ideally with your actions, because that benefits them. In fact, it's possible that in the Warhammer world, we only have myths and legends about gods because of people misunderstanding the gods of chaos. So, what does that word even mean anymore? With the Chaos Gods, and with any of the warp entities, we could take the power of belief route and say, within Warhammer, the term god doesn't mean the same thing as it does in real life, it's actually just the word for a powerful warp entity. That's similar to how Discworld or American Gods does it. Warhammer's power of belief mechanic is slightly different, but thematically it's kind of the same thing. But if we did use that description, we'd be leaving out everything that isn't a warp entity. None of these entities live up to the Earnest criteria, the ones from the start of the video, the way we use God in real life. Some of them could be said to be creators of specific species, like the Old Ones, or maybe the Catan, but those are all framed as being created through science that we don't know. They aren't particularly moral guardians. The gods of chaos have an interest in your daily activities, but not because they're passing moral judgment on the rightness of them, they just feed on the energy. They don't really understand morals. And even the Emperor's laws, like kill all the mutants or abhor the witch, were mostly practical laws implemented by a person that have since been elevated to divine commandments by a religious organization. And while there sort of is an afterlife in 40k, your soul dissolves into the warp, none of these entities created it. Again, it's just a natural mechanic of the universe. And while some of them can offer some form of salvation from it, immortality in the form of demon princes and living saints, that's considered extremely rare. Despite what their followers believe, it's incredibly unlikely they'll actually be saved. But as I said, having the Earnest discussion is kind of missing the point. Warhammer is a satire of many things, including religion. And while we can see behind the curtain, the serious discussion about what counts as a god is one that the characters frequently have in-world and appropriately, can never truly resolve. The Emperor, for example, was very clear that he was a powerful psyker, not a god, and that the Chaos Powers were malevolent warp beings, also not gods, and therefore worshipping them was actually just bad for all humans. In his opinion, everything worshipped as a god was actually just a powerful, malevolent entity out for their own benefit and trying to exploit humanity. And that's definitely true as far as we know in world. Other empires seem to have been aware of this. The Interrex from Horus Rising are aware of this. The Necrons are pretty much aware of this. But the Imperium that came after him found that giving everyone a rigid faith was a form of protection anyway, because of that power of belief. So whether he is or is not a god is irrelevant, because the religion itself is a useful tool for the Imperium. In Godblight, Robute Guilliman returns to the religious Imperium after 10,000 years from a time which was much more secular and is dismayed at this worship of the Emperor, even if he and the Adeptus Custodes, who think the same thing, agree that it's a really useful way to unite everybody. In that book, this is actually a talking point. If the Emperor is a powerful warp entity that can do miracles, isn't that basically the same thing? Does he count as a god now? What does the word even mean? Both of his advisors in this scene have slightly different views. Donus Maxim, a Space Marine librarian, holds to the Emperor's view. Power defines gods, but they're all false, said Maxim. Falsehood is the essence of godhood. They are lies. They may seem to be divine to primitive minds and their ability to grant favour, but they're inimical to all mortal life. The gods of chaos bring only horror. They see us as playthings and would destroy us all in the end. They're evil, every one. Man needs no gods, the Emperor was right. So by this definition, the word god can refer to an entity that's powerful enough, presumably compared to the viewer, like we might use the word demigod or godlike, but none of them are really, truly divine, they're just horrible monsters trying to trick you. Ilian Nastase, an Eldar Farseer and advisor to Guilliman, has a slightly wider view, but on the same thing. You're right when you say that power defines a god, he said. Temporal, spiritual, physical, it matters not. He fell silent a moment. My people define godhood in several ways, but there are two broad categories. The gods of the other sea, who are reflections of what you call the Materium, and the gods of the Materium itself, who you know as the Catan, though there are other, more ancient and even more terrible things than they. It's much too long a conversation to read out in full, but the Eldar point of view is that the defining trait of a god is puissance, just power, but also belief. If people have faith in a being, then it's a god. which leads to an uncomfortable realization. To many of your people, Primarch, son of the Emperor, you are a god. Because they believe in their billions, does that not make it so? A status I deny, said Gilliman icily. I am no god. How long is it until the first miracle is proclaimed in your name? And when that occurs, how will you be able to say that you were not responsible for it? For our purposes, Nastase's definition is so broad and all-encompassing that it's kind of useless. Literally anything people think is a god is one, including all the cargo cults and all those ancient aliens. And presumably including C3PO. That's the Eldar view, or maybe it only counts if it's things more powerful than them, which is a very Eldar way of thinking about it. Many of the things above are described as godlike or having been worshipped as a god, which implies that they aren't really. The Dragon of Mars had been abroad in the galaxy for millions of years before humanity had been a breath in the Creator's mouth, had drunk the hearts of stars, and then been worshipped as a god in 1,000 galaxies. That's from Mechanicum describing what we think is a Catan. And then, to make it a bit more confusing, we get lines like this one from The End and the Death. During the Siege of Terra and preparing for his final confrontation with Horus, the Emperor draws loads of power from the warp, but he has to be stopped, for if he draws too much power, he runs the risk of becoming the Dark King, the total annihilation of the universe, and as that being becomes a possibility, Malkador thinks, from meaninglessness there comes meaning. It was not a portent, it was a promise. It was the story of a god which we ignored, for there were no gods. Yet now there is. In a supreme effort to drive back chaos, we have become our own doom. The idea through that book is that there aren't really any gods. Okay, great, that's consistent with everything else, but that the Emperor might actually be about to become one. An actual, real, true god, which is even worse. Which means they are possible in 40k, but all these things aren't them? That earnest argument in the fiction, just like in real life, basically becomes semantics, a question to which we are never going to get a permanent answer, and that's because religion is one of the many things Warhammer is a satire of. The real, actual truth of the universe is, at best, secondary to most of the religious factions anyway. The Sisters of Battle and the Black Templars, modelled on the real-life Catholic Church, absolutely 100% believe the Emperor is God and absolutely shun anything that might get them closer to any sort of truth. That's all witchcraft or heresy. The Emperor is a god because they say so, and they'll burn anyone who disagrees, regardless of if they're correct. The horrible oppressive religion of the Imperium doesn't actually need the Emperor to exist. It's just another way the writers can portray this unchanging, ponderous, conservative, restrictive empire. On the flip side, the Word-bearers, the most devout followers of chaos, are aware that their gods are just malevolent warp entities, but since their quest is for the truth, and those chaos powers definitely exist, that seems to be enough for them. To the Word-bearers, rather than finding out that there were no gods after all, they see it as finding out what the gods truly are. The entities they worshipped as gods turned out to be malevolent warp beings who just want to eat everyone? Fine, guess that's what the gods are then. Let's keep worshipping them. After all, they can still give you power. Both of those are satires of religious belief and intolerance. Part of the grim darkness of 40k is the religion. At best, the religions of 40k are oppressive tools of social control with very little connection to or interest in the truth. At worst, they're a mistaken populace accidentally worshipping otherworldly entities who have no desire beyond consuming them. Faith is certainly a thing, but faith works in Warhammer regardless if the thing you have faith in is a god or not. So that doesn't help. And the fact that none of this is widely known, that everyone is in some way ignorant of the true horror or aware of it but can't stop it, is part of the whole bleakness of the setting. Are there gods in 40k? I think the only way you could really answer yes to that is if you invent an in-world definition of that term, like Ilian Nastase does. It's anything powerful, or anything in the warp, or anything people believe in. And even then, the setting directly questions that definition every chance it gets. Are there gods in 40k like we understand them, using the definition people would use in real life? No. The Emperor was right. In 40k, they don't exist. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more discussion about the weird themes of 40k, then there's a little video popping up just there to the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, well, you can like and subscribe, you can use our affiliate links to Firestorm Games in the thing below, or you can join us on Patreon, where at various levels you can vote on book clubs, get early access to videos, or join in on the Discord and our Tale of Four Gamers series. See ya!